Niamh Eastwood, thank you so much for joining me for a Corona Conversation. For people who don't know who you are, they clearly should, but do you just want to tell us what your job is and where you work and where you're filming from?
Okay, so Adam, lovely to see you again. I am in London and I work for Release. I'm the Executive Director of Release, and we are the UK Centre of Expertise on Drugs and Drug Law. We provide legal services and support to people who use drugs and those affected by the drug laws, but we also campaign for reform of drug policy, focusing on decriminalisation of possession of drugs.
And so following on from the conversations I've had with Steve and Zara and Alex in the last couple of days, it strikes me that of all the terrible things that are happening at the moment with COVID, there is perversely an opportunity where the arguments for decriminalisation perhaps have never been stronger. And I'm just thinking how you think that's going to play out in the UK and further afield. What are your thoughts?
I think you're absolutely right. Whilst we're in the middle of this crisis, perversely it is creating some opportunities for reform, not just within the kind of legal context, but also within the kind of treatment context as well. But certainly with regards to legal, what we are looking at is potentially a deprioritization of the policing of low-level drug offences, whilst the police focus resources on responses to the virus itself, not least people gathering, the need to disperse crowds, the need to get equipment to hospitals quickly. So I think we will see that, and then it'll be interesting to use it potentially as an opportunity to convince law enforcement that this should not be a priority for them. I think the other area that really is something that we're quite excited about, and that sounds really awful in the middle of this awfulness, but really is the kind of prescribing of methadone. So we have been really overwhelmed by the response of treatment providers in the UK who have moved heaven and earth to get clients off daily supervised consumption, daily pickup of methadone and buprenorphine, and on to much longer term scripts. And I think that's exciting because we can develop the evidence base to show that it really is unnecessary to require people to go for daily pickup. Like it's often not driven by clinical needs, it's driven by a kind of perverse need to control and surveil people who use drugs, and it's a very paternalistic approach to drug treatment. So I think that something positive could come out of this. At the same time, we need to be questioning ourselves is, why did it take a global pandemic to get here? We have an overdose crisis, and certainly that crisis should have provided for those opportunities in the past. But I think there will be some learning coming out of the current environment.
So I totally get the need for transformation of the treatment system. I guess as a paternalistic prescriber who occasionally worries about the safety of large supplies of methadone, for me it's about, is it safely stored? Is it going to add to someone's stability? And, much as I believe that early on in treatment, supervision can be beneficial and that daily structure can be useful, clearly it also limits people's ability to engage in other areas of their life and just feel normal.
Yeah, absolutely.
But prescribers are going to start having to have conversations that treat their patients as adults who are responsible and interested in their health and well-being.
I understand your paternalistic nature, but I also, too, in no other area of treatment do we make people stay on supervised consumption for weeks, months, and years. And it's all linked to their own behaviours outside of the treatment system around whether they're using on top. And, if we use the analogy of, someone who has diabetes, if they go to their doctor and say, I've eaten a chocolate cake, in no world would they take away their insulin. But with our client group, that's what happens. Their medication is often taken away and they are punished for being honest. So I do think that this is an opportunity. I'm still deeply worried about our client group because of the COVID situation. I think there are particular harms that are not being considered by governments and policymakers at the minute. I understand why. I understand this is well overwhelming for them, but also this is a population that is historically left behind. And I think there is a risk that in this crisis, they will be left behind again. And this is a high risk population, those who use problematically.
And they are not the group who you want to get sick. therefore overwhelming the NHS. There's actually never been a better economic reason, and there's endless economic reasons about the benefits of drug treatment to optimize treatment. And in fact, I'm perversely hoping there may be a bunch of people, and there's lots of them, who for years have been on suboptimal doses, partly because they want to be, and partly because we don't have the correct conversations with patients, that actually there'll suddenly be people who, instead of being on 40 milligrams and using a little bit every day, actually will get up to a therapeutic dose where they can actually see the benefits of treatment. But you're right, why does it take a crisis to just get common sense treatment out there? And I just hope we don't forget the lessons we're learning now when this is all a distant memory. We can't let governments forget, and I doubt the community certainly will.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So I'm just curious what you think with your crystal ball. So you've spoken about de facto decriminalisation not occurring because the police think that's the right thing to do. It's because the police have got other things to do. What would you hope that the government might formally and explicitly do in the coming weeks to alleviate the burden on people who are using drugs in a problematic fashion?
So, as I said, I don't think this is high on their priority list. So I think we are going to have to work through different agencies in order to relieve the pressure that our clients face, both in terms of law enforcement and in terms of accessing the drugs that they need. And that's not just people who are on treatment, but those who are using the unregulated market. So I think, one of the things that we're doing, there's a handful of police forces in the UK who are very pro harm reduction, are pro saving lives, which is kind of the core of policing, but see the way to achieve that is through protecting the well-being and health of people who use drugs, whether that is a dependent user or a recreational user. And so many of these guys are advocating, and we're working with them, advocating at a higher level, at a national level, to try and get guidance out there to deprioritize possession policing, but also to the supply side. I think you're aware of this, Adam, ourselves and Transform, and you kindly fed into a consultation we submitted to the government, to the Treasury Select Committee this week about the issues faced by people who use drugs and the market itself. And one of the things we called for was actually a deprioritization of interdiction of supply side activities, because we actually want to keep the market as stable as possible. We've been very lucky in the UK not to see some of the synthetic opiates such as fentanyl hit the market in the same way that they've experienced in the US and in Canada. And to contextualize it, it's really important that we do protect this market because, in Scotland, for example, the rate of drug-related death is almost equivalent to some of the US and Canadian rates. And that's without fentanyl. If fentanyl hits, it's going to be catastrophic. And so we've recommended that one way to prevent that is to encourage law enforcement actually just to let the supply that is currently come in, and don't don't use enforcement to seize the supply that's in the country at the minute, because actually we want that to last for as long as possible.
And don't leave dealers with the temptation of cutting their heroin with fentanyl, or inevitably, I guess, people going to the darknet directly, maybe seeking out fentanyl, but also my worry is people shifting to prescription medications to substitute, which I get the rationale for, but I said this to Alex, my worry is chaotic, unpredictable polydrug use. Some benzo here, some pregabalin here. And so you're right, a stable market allows people to regulate their consumption and reduce their risk.
And we're seeing instability already. The synthetic cannabinoid market's been hit pretty hard. So we're seeing up in parts of the country that it's really hard for people to get hold of it. And as you know, that's a drug that's used with specific populations, particularly those who are homeless, those in prisons. And it seems as if the shift is towards some of the synthetic benzos. So that in itself carries harms. The synthetic cannabinoids aren't great, but also these drugs aren't great. And it's just going to be making sure that we have harm reduction messages in place, that we're supporting people to get into treatment as quickly as possible. So, and again, that kind of access to treatment is going to be super interesting around the kind of low threshold access. So you're no longer going to be able to bring people in and drug test them in the same way and supervise them in the same way. So we're going to get people scripted really quickly on drugs like buprenorphine.
Yeah, no, I mean, I fantasize.
Should be part of it as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I fantasize having a backpack with depot buprenorphines and being able to go out to homeless populations. Unfortunately, I hear there might be a supply issue with that, some of those preparations, which is not helpful. The synthetic cannabinoids is a real issue because even outside COVID, if you're someone who seeks treatment from a provider with a problem for synthetic cannabinoids, we don't have treatment. You know, we can offer people symptomatic medication, which most doctors aren't going to prescribe because they're going to be benzos. So you've got people craving using on the street, and my worry is some of those actually might fall back to opiates. Yeah. So if we then have a whole bunch more people seeking treatment, which is a good thing, it sounds like you're fairly confident that the UK's current drug treatment service has the capacity to meet that?
Well, again, I mentioned the submission that we put into Parliament earlier in the week, and we've called for more money. I mean, the drug treatment services here have been cut by 26% in terms of funding in the last 4 years. And that's terrifying. You know, they're already, I think, coping with a cohort of about 190,000 clients, but there's a potential 320,000 in total. So that's an additional 130,000. Now, obviously, not all of those people are going to come into treatment, but you are talking about having to scale up capacity in a very short space of time for potentially tens of thousands. You know, we've talked to a lot of the treatment providers, and I've got nothing but respect for the way that they have responded to this crisis and really sought to make sure that the health of the clients is protected and that the risk of them contracting the virus is reduced by reducing the kind of level of supervision and engagement. But you know, they feel confident that this can be done, but they do need more money, and that's why we've called on the UK government to invest more heavily in treatment. Not only do they need to make up the losses of the 26%, but probably add a further 20% in funding, maybe 30%. So those are things that need to be supported.
What's your take on the need to do something with the prison population? Obviously, if a COVID outbreak hits in a big prison, that's going to be a real issue. But working in a prison as I do, I also know one of the biggest fears people have who leave on a script is that they simply don't have food and accommodation and they can't access their script. I mean, I'm worried about lots of people being released on a script or off a script and then just dropping off, and then that, you know, leading to risks of overdose. But the balance can't be that being in prison is the best place to be.
I mean, prison's a petri dish. We just had the first death today in one of the prisons in England. You know, it's probably the least safe place to be in the country at the minute. You know, like many countries across the world, our prisons are overcrowded. They are beyond capacity. We also have the added problem of prison guards and prison staff reporting in sick. So one report last week estimated that 1,000 prison guards had called in and were self-isolating as a result of the virus. That then led to a lockdown of all prisoners, which is essentially solitary confinement. So not only are we seeing, you know, the risks of disease spread in you know, literally like a forest fire. I mean, we're also seeing significant human rights abuses. It is not acceptable to lock down, you know, in the region of 86,000 people for 23 hours a day. So the first thing that could be done is the release of prisoners who have been incarcerated for non-violent offences. And I think in 2018, it was estimated that 69% of the 57,000 imprisoned were there for low-level non-violent offences. So everything from drug offences through to acquisitive crime. I agree with you, there are problems if someone hasn't got somewhere to go. But I think we need to look at where they do have somewhere to go. So get those guys out now, today. There should be no excuse for them to be, you know, continue to be in custody. And then we look about how can we transition people safely out of prison into community spaces that can support them. Because normally it would be things like hostels, but they're not necessarily safe at the moment either. So we need to make sure that we are providing accommodation that allows for isolation, but also has wraparound support. And it's very similar with the homeless population. You know, you have to congratulate the Mayor of London, who has taken the initiative to house, I think it was 500 people who were homeless over the weekend in the intercontinental hotels. But it's not enough just to put them into accommodation. You know, how are they getting access to their drugs if they're a dependent drug user? Do they need access to treatment? Getting food in there. So it needs to be not just getting a roof over somebody's head, but it needs to be wraparound services. And that's a huge task for the services. But I also think, like, we're in unprecedented times. You know, people are willing to volunteer, to come together, to, you know, really support services. And I think there is a big enough field. Like, a load of us, we provide services at release, but I'm a policy person and, you know, do a bit of fundraising. I'm happy to do that outreach with people, you know, and I think there's a big enough network where we could come together and build a kind of community response to this as well, that reduces the burden on NHS services than others who are at the front line of fighting the virus.
One of the things you just raised, which I should have thought about but hadn't, is of course the drug supply into prison is also going to dry up. Mm-hmm. And that means there's people won't have their tradable commodities, but mm-hmm. people have almost managed to avoid coming into treatment because they've had their synthetic cannabinoids or their heroin. All of a sudden are going to be flooding prison treatment services to get on to methadone or buprenorphine. Yeah. And I think one of the things I have to do at the end of this phone call is have another conversation saying we need to make sure that those prisons can ramp up those services, because a lot of prison services might go, I'm sorry, you've been here for 3 months. You didn't mention you were using heroin. What's the big rush now? And the big rush is there's no drugs. I'm going to be released and I don't want to die. Yeah. So we're going to have to get a lot of people to suddenly open their eyes to the job they should have been doing for a long, long time. And
yeah, absolutely.
I think that's where I'm left more sad by these conversations than anything else, is no one's calling for anything else other than offering people good quality care at the point and in the place they need it, and treat people with respect. It shouldn't take a crisis to suddenly go, oh, we should be doing that.
There are challenges as well. You mean, you know, we're talking about medication for the opiate clients, the people who use opiates. But I mean, how do we deal with crack cocaine? How do we deal with the synthetic cannabinoids? How do we, you know, and I think actually this is the time also for innovation around looking at substitute prescribing. You know, you talked, and you know, you and I have talked before about the need to get people who are on the synthetic benzos onto benzos. Like, let's prescribe benzos. Like, there is armory in the pharmaceutical bag to do some of this work, and I think this is the time to maybe think about how do we do this.
But it's an armory that's locked up in a safe with 2 different keys, and then they haven't been open for so long, no one's even got the combination.
But they're opening it now. You know, that's the difference. You know, you're now seeing prescribing behaviour that you would never have imagined. Like, if I said to you, Adam, you know, 2 months ago that tens of thousands of people would be taken off supervised consumption, put onto weekly or fortnightly scripts, you would have told me to, you know.
I would have said there was a lot of people who shouldn't be there, because it's a bit of a lottery. I mean, I hope we can not just get through this, but we maintain those lessons. Is there anything else from a UK perspective you would like to share with people before?
I think some of the work that we're doing to try and build some kind of knowledge from the ground about what's going on with the supply chain, would that be helpful?
I think that'd be fascinating.
So, you mean, well, you know, you're part of these conversations, but really, I mean, one of the concerns that we have is, you know, as the supply chain dries up, both across kind of, I suppose, what we would term recreational substances and substances like heroin and cocaine, I mean, what's going to happen to the market? Yeah, and we want to try and pick up in as real time as possible what is happening. So we are building a network across the country of people who could feed into that, in particular drug user groups, to get their view of what's happening to the market on the ground. We've also linked in with some of the forums so that we can get information from the forums. And that's everything from forums like the Alliance, which focuses on opiates and OST, through to reaching out to some of the chemsex forums. So again, trying to get that real-time information, setting up a network of journalists who often will be interviewing suppliers. So trying to find out from suppliers what is going on the ground, and trying to make sure that we have that information so that we can respond with harm reduction messages, harm reduction advice, interventions that can help protect people's lives at this time, but also too that we can let people know about what services are close to them that they may want to access. So I think that's something that, it's a real challenge, not least because, as you will be aware, the drug user movement was kind of decimated in the 2010s because of the recovery agenda and that move to abstinence being the only kind of goal of treatment. So we've lost some of that, certainly amongst the kind of opiate using population. But I think this is a real opportunity to galvanize that again. So I'm quite excited about working with the current guys, the Input and Europod and some of the peer outreach workers in the UK to build that network up again. And I think that's a positive. And I think, one of our concerns, our view is at the minute, and obviously this is a very fast moving situation, is that the supply currently within the UK is probably pretty stable, but what we will see is adulterants being added, smaller deals, more expensive, but that when that runs out, what comes next? And I think that's what we're really looking out for. So we're also going to be putting up on the website an opportunity for people to feed in information through web forms, and obviously working with you guys on the Global Drug Survey, which we're super excited about.
Well, and feeding into that idea about having to think for other groups and having conversations you wouldn't normally have. I've just done a video on what do you do if you're alcohol dependent and you're running out of alcohol? How can you detox yourself on alcohol? And I've just done one on cannabis, and I'll be doing one on GHB, because I think that the one thing that's evident from everyone I've spoken to is the drug using community, which has a history of always being able to look out for itself, is going to do that again now. But if the drugs run up, there are going to be problems that people are going to need to manage. And I would never tell anyone in any normal circumstance, this is how you might think about detoxing with alcohol, because we don't do it. But there are safer ways of doing it. And that's the time you need to have that conversation. So I worry about what happens when the supplies dry up as well. It's challenging times, Niamh.
It is. And one shameless plug, Talking Drugs, which is the website that we run, it's a multimedia website reporting on developments in drug policy and harm reduction. It's in 8 languages. We would really ask people to let us know what's going on in their country, both in terms of their experience of drug use, their experience of law enforcement and drugs policing, their experience around the supply chain, and any human rights abuses that are going on. Because one of our concerns is obviously that the mainstream media are going to be very busy with the kind of bigger story, not the bigger stories, that's wrong, but the stories that impact on the whole population. And again, the people we work with, our community gets left behind. So, we really encourage people to go to talkingdrugs.org and to send us information about what's going on in their country so that we can report that in through that medium.
Yeah, and I'd encourage people to email me at adam@globaldrugsurvey.com, and if we can do an interview with you wherever you are in the world, whether you're a doctor, a frontline worker, someone who's using drugs, to share your experience and maybe some of the lessons you've learned. There are lots of countries who have, are weeks behind where Spain is or Italy, and there are lessons we can hopefully pick up to make things easier for us. So you plug away.
Thank you, Adam, and you too.
All right, and Niamh, thank you so much. My guess is we'll come back and talk to you in a couple of weeks, but until then, stay safe, keep your distance.
Stay safe. Bye.
Bye.
And so the question that you chose to ask, will it be better where we're going? And though the answer I don't know for a fact, still my heart is saying, oh yeah.
Still just taking it one day at a time. Still don't know what I'm trying to find. Really I don't mind, cause I'll be fine. Yeah, I'll be fine. Yeah, no longer focused on yesterday, and I don't care, the rest will say whatever they want. What's left to say? What's left to say? Cause I'm leaving all the